Hey everybody, and welcome. Today, we're jumping into a really old and honestly kind of spooky story from the Bible. It's got a nervous king, a huge battle, and a ghostly visitor. Let's get into it.
I mean, come on, who hasn't felt that? That knot in your stomach before a big test or a huge game where you just wish you knew what was going to happen. Well, the king in our story, he was feeling that, but like a million times worse.
So let's meet our king. His name was Saul, and he was in some serious trouble. He was about to face a giant battle, and he felt totally and completely alone. And when you're that scared, you start thinking about doing things you normally wouldn't even consider.
Just try to imagine it. You're the king, responsible for everyone, and this massive enemy army is heading straight for you. The first thing you do is pray, right? Ask God for a plan, for some help. And that's exactly what Saul did. The only problem was, God was silent. Nothing.
Now, you got to understand, God had very specific ways of talking to people back then. He'd send messages in dreams, or through something called the Urim that the priests used, or he'd send one of his messengers, the prophets. But for Saul, right now, every single one of those lines of communication was dead. No dreams, no answers, no prophets, just static.
So Saul is just completely desperate at this point, and he comes up with a plan, a really bad, forbidden plan. And here's the crazy part. Saul was the one who had banned all the sorcerers and mediums from the kingdom because God said that stuff was a no-go. But now he's so terrified he decides to break his own law and find one in secret.
And this is where the story gets really creepy. Saul puts on a disguise so no one will recognize him, and late at night, he finds this sorceress in a town called Endor. He's about to ask her to do something that was strictly forbidden.
So what does he want? He asks the woman to contact a familiar spirit. Now, what is that exactly? Well, our source explains that people back then believed these were like ghost guides, the spirit of someone who had died that a medium could supposedly call up and talk to for advice. And Saul has someone very specific in mind. He wants to talk to the prophet Samuel, who had been his mentor but had recently died. The sorceress starts her ritual, and then she just screams, because suddenly a figure appears that looks just like the old prophet, and it starts to talk.
Okay, this is the big question, right? Was this really the ghost of the prophet Samuel who came back from the dead to chat with Saul in a sorceress's cave? Well, according to the source material we're looking at, there's no way. Absolutely not.
Think about it logically for a second. God had already shut down all of his approved ways of talking to Saul. He wasn't answering through dreams or prophets or anything else. So why on earth would he suddenly pop up and send a message through a sorceress, a method he specifically commanded people to stay away from? It just doesn't add up. Our source says it had to be a trick. And the Bible itself gives us this massive clue. It says right here that Saul died for his sin and for asking a familiar spirit for advice instead of asking God. See the difference? It clearly separates the two. He was talking to the spirit, not to the real Samuel or to the Lord. So the takeaway here is pretty clear. The source concludes that this figure wasn't Samuel at all. It was a counterfeit, a fake. It was a deception from Satan, not to help Saul, but to completely crush his spirit, make him feel hopeless, and lead him straight to his own ruin.
Now, let's zoom out a bit, because this whole idea of talking with the dead, it wasn't new even in Saul's time. According to our source, it's actually one of the oldest deceptions in the world, and it's still very much alive today. You can actually trace this lie all the way back to the very beginning, in the Garden of Eden. The first lie ever told was, "You will not surely die." The idea that death isn't final. That lie grew into ancient practices like witchcraft, and it's still around today, just with a new name, spiritualism. It's all based on that same core idea that we can talk to people after they've died. So if these familiar spirits weren't the ghosts of people, what were they? The source is very direct about this. It says they were actually evil angels, messengers of Satan, who were just pretending to be people's loved ones in order to fool them.
Okay, so a spooky story about a king and a fake ghost. What does that have to do with us? Well, it actually has a lot to do with us. It's all about how we deal with being scared and worried about what's coming next.
King Saul just couldn't handle not knowing. He couldn't stand the uncertainty of the next day's battle. And that feeling of desperation, that need to know, drove him to do something he knew was wrong. And we can feel that pull too, can't we? That intense desire to just know how things are going to turn out. But there is a better way. Instead of freaking out like Saul,
Our source suggests a different path. We can choose to trust God, even when the future's a total mystery. We can pray for strength. And instead of desperately trying to find out what God hasn't told us, we can focus on and rely on the things He has already revealed in His Word.
At the end of the day, Saul's biggest problem was his lack of faith. He tried to force an answer, to rip that curtain away from the future. And by doing that, he walked right into a trap that led to his downfall. Trusting what God has already said is always the safer and wiser path.
And so, that leaves us with a really important question to think about. When you're feeling scared or worried about what tomorrow holds, where are you going to turn for light?